All right, and then we can start the webinar.
Right. Okay, we're just going to wait for a little bit so people are slowly coming in. But thanks everyone for coming to the last session. We have a few excellent talks lined up. We're just going to wait for 1 minute. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to start. This is the last session of this Cuny conference. Thanks for being here. So I'm Ming Xiang, and I will be serving as the session chair. So before we begin, so a few things. So if you don't mind, you can rename yourself. So just indicate whether you are a student, a postdoc, faculty. That will be helpful during the Q&A session. And during the talks, you can ask questions anytime. You can type your questions under the Q&A, like under that little button. But if you want me to read out your questions, you can also write that down. Just make a note to me and I can read your question for you. Okay. And so with that said, we are ready to start. So our first talk is from Arella Gasso and Mary Ellen MacDonald. And Arella is going to give the presentation. The talk title is Language Production and the Uncertainty, Advanced Planning and Incrementality. So Arella, you can share your screen.
Thank you. Okay, is that good? Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. So when we think about language production, we often start with thinking about a plan, right? I have to turn my message into words, my words into phonemes, sounds, and only then I can begin producing what it is that I want to communicate. Now, what's interesting about these production plans is that I don't actually have to have my full utterance planned out in advance, but instead there's a degree of incrementality, which is this idea that speakers can plan and produce simultaneously. And so if we look at what this would look like on a timeline, so we have time going here from left to right, the speaker begins planning what it is that they want to produce, can then begin producing what they've planned already and continue planning the rest as they go. And so we end up with this really nice balance here between how much we're planning in advance and how much we're planning as we go. And there's been a nice body of work showing that we do tend to plan at least several words or phrases in advance, but the balance between and how much we plan in advance and how much we plan incrementally as we go is very flexible and very strategic. So depending on the current context demands, depending on the task demands, I can decide how much I want to plan in advance versus incrementally. Now, one interesting task demand to think about is perhaps the one in which we use language most frequently, which is turn taking in everyday conversation. And so the idea in turn taking is that the first speaker here, who I will refer to as a woman, begins speaking, then there is a very quick pause, and then the other speaker, who I will refer to as a man, responds to whatever the woman said. And what's interesting about this timeline is that that pause is only about 200 milliseconds. This is quite a puzzle for language production researchers because we know that planning a single word takes about 600 milliseconds, planning an entire clause takes about 1500 milliseconds, And so it's not totally clear how those 200 milliseconds are enough for us to take in whatever the other speaker said, plan our response, and then launch it in time. And so what many researchers in this area of turn taking have suggested is that actually what happens is that speakers begin planning their response during their interlocutor's turn. So the idea is that while the woman here is speaking, the man engages in some sort of predictive comprehension, trying to understand what she is asking him or what she's commenting about. And based on that predictive comprehension, he can begin planning his own response to her. And this way, once the pause comes, he's basically ready, and all he has to do is launch his response. And there's been a nice body of work looking at this type of advanced planning and turn taking in recent years. So here's one example from this Vogel study, where participants have to answer these general knowledge questions. So which character, also called 007, appears in the famous movies? And participants would simply have to respond, James Bond. But they heard this question in another form, which is which character from the famous movies is also called 007? And there's an important difference here between the two questions, which is the one on top, which they call the early condition. Participants get that critical information, the 007, mid-question already. So it's already in the middle of the incoming question that they know what they're being asked about. They know the answer, and so they can begin planning their response. Whereas in the late condition here on the bottom, which character from the famous movies is also called 007, they only get that critical information all the way at the end. And so they can't really plan that much in advance, but only right at the end. And sure enough, what they find is that participants are faster to respond in the early condition, indicating that already in mid-question, when they get the critical information, they can begin planning their response. And so if we look back at this diagram that I showed before, this makes sense. Participants have some sort of prediction about what's being asked of them, and they can plan their response and then launch it. But when we looked at this, we said there's still a bit of a puzzle here, right? Because it's not always the case that questions are so clear-cut and the answers are so obvious and short as with the 007, where you either know what the answer is mid-question or you don't. But instead, there's a degree of uncertainty because the man's response here is going to depend on what the woman is asking. And he may have a good idea of what that's going to be, but until he gets the full information, he can't totally be sure. And so there's this question of, well, if he's not sure what she's asking of him, how can he be sure of his own response? And how can he start planning his response if there's still this degree of uncertainty? And is it even worth it? And so that's the big question that we kind of started with. So on the one hand, we have this pressure for early planning. On the other hand, the speaker's message itself may still be uncertain. So the speaker is not sure yet what they want to say. How can he plan in advance in this case? Does he plan in advance, or how does planning proceed? And so in the current study, we manipulate this message uncertainty, how much the speaker themselves knows about what they want to say, controlling when it is exactly that the full message becomes available. And we're going to ask what kind of strategies are used. If we started with saying that we're so flexible with this advanced planning, what kind of strategies are used in this case for language production? And specifically, we're going to be looking at measures of word order, asking if the flexibility in word order can allow us to accommodate this uncertainty and begin planning something. And what kind of effect does that have on onset latencies? And so we had a very simple paradigm where participants view a screen with 4 object images. And after 2.2 seconds of preview, a gray background appears behind one half of the screen, indicating which are the 2 target images. And participants' task was simply to answer the question, which are the 2 target images? And so in this case, they would say something like the pear and the vest, or the vest and the pear, and they could respond in either order. And participants were told that their recordings would later be used for another participant who would have to identify which were the targets. And so this is what the trial looked like, where we had every 2 objects rotating around each other to avoid effects of the spatial location on the order in which participants name the objects. Now, what I just showed you is what we called the different condition, because participants view 4 different objects. But then we had another condition, which we were somewhat more interested in, where participants again view 4 object images. But this time, one of the objects overlaps and appears on both sides of the screen. And so if you think about it at this point, even though there's still a degree of uncertainty because the participant doesn't know yet what they're going to have to produce, they at least have some partial information because they know that no matter what, the target images are going to include that vest, that overlapping object. And so if they wanted to plan something in advance, they can begin planning the vest, even during this preview. And then once the cue appears, all they have to do is add on the pair, but they've basically done half the work already in their early planning. And so this is what we call the overlap condition because one of the images overlapped and appeared on both sides of the screen. And this is what a trial looked like. Same thing, except this time we have one object overlapping. Now just a few more details about our experiment. So this was still run in lab. It was just over a year ago. And participants first went through a familiarization phase where they viewed each one of the single images with its label underneath. Then they had 80 experimental items with 40 in each condition. The overlapping object was counterbalanced across lists to avoid effects of the specific image properties on the order in which participants name them. Every 4 objects in an item were matched for their number of syllables and for the frequency. And finally, we used forced alignment and vowel extraction to extract the onset and offset times of each word in the utterance. And our predictions specifically pertained to the overlap condition where we knew that they at least had some partial information, something they could begin planning in advance. And we thought that under uncertainty, producers will prioritize the words that they are certain to need. So they're going to work with what they have, plan whatever it is that they can. And so in this case, we should see that they place the overlapping object first in their response, indicating that they planned it earlier, that they planned it first. And this might provide a benefit in onset latencies because, again, they've planned half their response even before they get the full information, before they get the gray background. So we could take a look at our results. So the first result we're going to look at is their choice of ordering these 2 objects. So whether they place the overlapping object first or the non-overlapping object first. In this case, we're only looking at the overlap condition because that's where we had the overlapping object. In the different condition, there's no sense of overlap because they saw 4 different objects. And what we find is that sure enough, participants are more likely to place the vest or the overlapping object first in their response, so saying the vest and the pair compared to the pair and the vest, indicating that they kind of prioritize that they planned it first, and that's why we're seeing it first in their response. And so now we could ask, okay, so they're planning this earlier, they're placing it first in their response, but how does this change anything, if at all, in their later planning stages? How does this compare to when they don't produce the overlapping one first or to their productions in the different condition? And so to do that, we're going to look at their onset latencies. And so here we're going to have on the x-axis is each of the 5 words in their utterance. So their utterance was always the object 1 and the object 2. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative time from when the cue appeared, so from when the gray background appeared. And I'm going to start with just showing the first 2 words, so the object 1. And we find that participants are faster to begin speaking in the overlap condition, but only when they place the overlapping object first. So only when they potentially plan that one earlier, even before the cue appeared, they are able to be ready earlier and launch the response earlier than the other cases. Now, it's interesting to note in this context that the word "the" appeared no matter what. They had to produce that word in all cases, and yet we still see this difference even at that first determiner, the word "the." And this aligns with previous work that kind of the minimal planning unit is going to be the functional phrase. So we're not willing to kind of detach the determiner from the noun. We're not just going to blurt out the word "the" and then continue. We'll really keep them together. And if we look at the rest of the word positions, we find that this benefit is continued throughout the utterance, and there's no interaction with word position. So this suggests to us that they get this benefit at the beginning, but then planning stages proceed similarly in all cases. We next wanted to replicate this in experiment 2. And so in experiment 2, we did use the same design, except this time with typed responses. By this point, we were online only, and so this study was run online, and we wanted to make it more online friendly, and so we wanted to make it shorter. And so we did not have a familiarization phase, and we reduced the number of items to 62, with 31 in each condition. Again, the overlapping object was counterbalanced across lists. And again, every 4 objects in a display were matched for the number of syllables and frequency. Of course, here it's typed responses, and so the number of characters that they actually have to type out does not necessarily correspond to the number of syllables, so we just want to keep that in mind when we look at the results. And so what we find is that, again, participants are more likely to type the overlapping object first in their response. And again, this provides a nice benefit in the onset latencies. So they're faster to begin in the overlap condition only when they place the overlapping object first. And again, we don't see the interaction. So this is basically maintained similarly throughout all word positions. It is important to note just in this context that the data here for the typing is a bit noisier, because if a participant made a typo or used the backspace, we discarded that observation and any later observations in that trial. But we still have enough to see this nice effect. And so to sum up what we've seen so far, we find evidence of this early planning even under message uncertainty, where participants are basically using whatever it is that they have, the partial information, and so they're prioritizing planning the portions of the utterance that they know they're going to need, place them in the initial position, and then whatever is added on later is just added on later. And we find that this early planning provides a benefit in onset latencies, but we don't see that that changes something downstream. So we don't find evidence for something different going on throughout their planning later. Now, I think there are many, many ways in which this can go. This kind of framework and this type of thinking. I'm just going to share with you a few of our current and future directions here. So one question is if participants will change not only their word order, which is pretty simple, right? The vest and the pair and the vest, no big deal, but maybe also sentence structure, which is a bit more dramatic. So for that, we're going to look at the date of alternation. And this is a study that we did again online, but this time with spoken production. And I'm going to show you some preliminary data, but the design that we have is as follows. Participants first get a verb, give, pass, hand, or show. And then they view a display very similar to the displays that we saw before, except this time the target images always include at least one animal and one object. Now in the display that you see here, the animal is overlapping, and so this is what we call the animal overlap condition. And then we had another display where the object was overlapping, and so this is what we call the object overlap condition. Now what participants have to do is simply take the verb that they got and create a sentence with the target images. And so in this case, in the animal overlap condition, they would have to say something like, give the tiger the apple, or give the apple to the tiger. And our prediction was that in the animal overlap condition, they will want to prioritize that animal that appears on both sides of the screen, place it first in their response. And so they should be producing the double object construction saying something like, give the tiger the apple. Whereas in the object overlap, they may want to prioritize the object and place that first in their response. And so we should see that they say something like, give the apple to the tiger. And so let me show you the data that we have transcribed so far. Again, this is still ongoing, but I'll show you what we've got. So again, these are our 2 conditions. And our prediction is a higher proportion of animal first utterances in trials of animal overlap compared to object overlap. So I'm going to plot the 2 conditions here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the proportion of responses. Let's look first just at the animal overlap condition. And sure enough, we find that participants are more likely to say give the tiger to the apple, so they're placing it first there. And that's maybe not so surprising. What we really want to do is compare this to the object overlap condition. And this is what the data look like. And so the interesting comparison here is really these two light blue bars. So far we see that numerically it's in the difference that we're expecting. And so we'll have to see how that turns out. Stay tuned. And I think especially the onset latency data here will be extremely interesting because they already get that verb at the beginning and they're creating these different sentence structures. So it'll be really interesting to see how this turns out. Now, another kind of current / future direction that I want to share is one that's hopefully going to help us address a certain confound, which is, could it be the case that just having two identical objects on the screen creates some sort of visual salience and grabs participants' attention, and that's why we see that they're placing it first, that they're placing the overlapping object first? And so we tried running a study where we again had two vests, for example, but it's two different tokens of the same object. And so the idea was that this would take away from having those two identical objects on at the same time, but it's still the same word, so they should still be able to plan that in advance. This didn't quite work because it turns out that participants really like to tell you that the vest is purple and that it's different than the gray vest, so they like to make that distinction. And so for our purposes, that wasn't great for what we were trying to test, but I still think this has potential, and we'll keep thinking about how to get over that. And if there are any suggestions, of course, I'm happy to hear them. But overall, I think that the kind of big future direction that we're thinking about here is that we really have this interesting intersection going on here in these situations of turn taking where you have a degree of uncertainty and you have this pressure to plan in advance, but maybe you're not so sure, and is it worth it? What kind of strategies do you use? And of course, taking it up to a more conversational and natural setting is a big goal to really understand how these things work together. And so with that, I would just like to thank my advisor, Mary Ellen McDonald, and the Language and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at UW-Madison, and all the wonderful RAs that worked on this project. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Aurelia, for a great talk. We have a few questions lined up. We'll have 10 minutes for questions. So the first question will come from Emily Morgan.
Hi, thanks for a great and interesting talk. My question was whether you have any data about whether people are using these strategies consciously versus subconsciously.
Yeah, so we asked at the end, out of the, I think it was 64 participants in the first experiment, only about 2 or 3 said that they were consciously doing something. And we literally asked, did you use any strategies? And so it seems to be that not that many are actually conscious of using it.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, our next question comes from Roger Levy.
Hi, thank you. This is a very cool and interesting talk. I have a minor detail question and then a sort of interpretation question. So my minor detail question is, did participants always use the definite determiner? And if they didn't always use the definite determiner, is there any difference in, are there any patterns in the differences between conditions, ordering, and so forth? And then my interpretation question is, how can you be sure that that the key effects you're seeing are being driven by the kind of strategic planning considerations you're describing, rather than something a little bit less strategic along the lines of, well, when you have 2 instances of a vest on the screen, the word vest gets activated and becomes available more quickly and more prominently when there's only one instance.
Right. So for the first question, some participants did just kind of say, vest and pair. And so we didn't include those in the analyses for the latencies. For the second question, so I think it's interesting to see that we see the difference in latencies, for example, only in the overlap condition only when they place the overlapping object first. And so I don't know if it was just something about, having those two up. I don't know if we would see that advantage, that difference. It was just something about activation.
Great. Roger, do you have anything to follow up?
I do, but if there are other questions, please continue on. Like, I could go on way too long, so I can put them in the discussion.
Okay, so we're going to move on to other questions. So the next question comes from Jennifer Arnold.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really cool talk. So I was interested in your interpretation of the effect you're seeing of overlap. And so you talked about it a little bit in terms of attention towards the objects because they're overlapping or because they're similar. Do you think this is mediated by any higher level representations about things like topichood, or like this story is about the jackets? And whether you didn't really talk too much about that different colored vest condition that you did, and maybe that would give you some insight into it. I mean, so I'm not sure why you didn't want to look at it, maybe because you had extra words in there, which changes the latency, but the choice about which one to put first might tell you something about whether just that also feeds into this kind of topical representation of what, why they're interested in the jackets.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting to look into that case of the purple jacket and what's happening in those cases. So for us, just for ruling out that potential confound, we really wanted it to compare to the original study that we ran. And so if participants are taking this extra consideration into account and it kind of changes their whole utterance, then it wasn't a great comparison for us. I think it could still be a very interesting experiment. We were piloting it just about a year ago, and then things happened, and so we could still follow through with it. And I agree, it would be interesting to see why they're doing that, or what cases they're doing it, or how it affects their latency. So I do think that's kind of an interesting question in itself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Shota Moma.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm Shota from UMass. Very interesting talk, very clear presentation. Thank you. So my question is about the possibility of doing something similar in the sentence structure planning. Do you think if you juxtapose two event pictures, like no lexical item shared, but if those two pictures are overlapping in terms of the kind of structures that you can use, would you expect a similar kind of effect? And do you think that's plausible to implement, feasible to implement using a kind of task?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's a great idea, and it is something that I've been thinking about. So you can imagine, even I showed these examples with the verb, with the give or something like that. You can imagine having two kind of event pictures where participants are going to have to describe one of them, and maybe in one condition the action is shared, so it's the same kind of verb that you could use, to give, and in another it's a different type of verb. And in one case, people can potentially begin planning when it's the shared verb, whereas in another case they can't. And so I do think that's a very interesting direction to think about. And
I was thinking even more abstract things, like whether two events are transitive versus intransitive, whether two events tends to be associated with passive and active, whether two events associated with an accusative or a negative. And so those kinds of non-lexical plans whether you can investigate those using the kind of paradigm you're describing. So I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's cool. Very cool. Yeah, so like having an abstract kind of construction that can be shared across both. So that's a little different because you can't, like you said, you can't actually plan the lexical items. You can't begin planning kind of the beginning of your sentence, which is what's going on in what we're seeing. But I think that would be really cool to look at too. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so our last question comes from Zavi Nambudiripat.
Hi, thank you for such a great talk. So I was thinking about what the participants were told, like the instructions they were given. So you said that they were creating stimuli for another experiment, right? Where like other participants would have to like pick which side. So I'm wondering if you highlighted the participants that the other people would have to pick quickly, or that there was something about, oh, they'd have to be able to disambiguate between the two sides of the image. Um, would you maybe find some differences? Because then, like, I would expect that they would pick the non-overlapping object because it would help, right, the people. So I'm just curious about, you know, like how the task led them to choose maybe different orders, and like the different, you know, communicative pressures that are often interacting and competing when we're planning. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So they were told that other participants would have to identify which images they were talking about. They weren't told that the other participants would have to do it at any specific speed, like that they would have to do it fast or not. But our own participants were told to speak up as quickly as they could. And I also, you know, an alternative outcome that I was sort of expecting is the one that you're describing, where, you know, you should really say the pair first if you want someone else to be able to identify this as quickly as possible. And so I think that's another indication that they're kind of more centered on their own and on speaking up quickly themselves. And so placing the vest first, even though it's maybe a little less considerate from the audience design perspective. But that's what we see.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. And we still have a minute and a half. We actually have a new question coming in from Martin Pickering. Martin, could you unmute yourself? Or you want me to read your question? All right, maybe I will read.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, my computer. Sorry, can you use this method to determine to what level you have planned the word vest? I mean, whether you've planned it just to the meaning or whether you've actually planned the phonology.
Right, that's an open question. So currently, no. We could think of, you know, having some sort of distractor or something like that, a phonological distractor, semantic distractor, just to try and see if that's affecting something. So it would take it would definitely take an extra tweak to the paradigm, but we can't really currently say to what level it's really being planned. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ariella, for that great talk. So we're going to move on to the next talk. And our next talk comes from Cassidy Wyatt and Margaret Kendall and Colin Phillips. So you can go ahead and share your screen. And the talk title is Number Attraction in Pronoun Production, Evidence for Antecedent Feature Retrieval.
Hi, thank you for coming to our talk. I'm Cassidy. And now that I'm unmuted, my name's Maggie, and so we're just going to dive right in. So pronouns are a large part of everyday language. In fact, they are some of the most frequently used words in spoken English. Now, when hearing a pronoun, you need to use information from the linguistic and non-linguistic context to figure out exactly who or what it refers to. And at times, this can be a bit tricky, especially if there are multiple entities available in the context that could serve as potential reference. But here we're talking about production. And when producing a pronoun, on the other hand, this ambiguity is removed. So the speaker, as the one planning the sentence, should have a clear idea of what the referent is. For instance, in describing this picture, I could tell you, this is my favorite mug. I like it the most of all my mugs because it can hold the most tea. Since I know what my referent is, it seems unlikely that I would ever make a mistake in how I refer to it. For instance, I probably wouldn't say something like, I like them the most instead of it, especially since in this context, I can see my mug and I know that there's only one of it. But oddly enough, it appears that in some contexts, speakers do make this kind of pronoun number error. We stumbled across this finding while investigating agreement attraction for reflexive pronouns and verbs. So agreement attraction occurs when nearby or intervening material interferes with normal agreement processes, causing the produced agreement target to match the features of an entity other than the intended controller. For example, in these two sentences, the bolded verb agrees with the plural lure cabinets instead of the intended subject, key. In our task, participants watched and described scenes. The reflexive eliciting experiment had these filler trials where participants used pronouns to refer to the object of the action. Curiously, we found that although there was no attraction effect for reflexives, so speakers rarely made any errors, speakers did produce what looked like number attraction errors in the pronoun filler trials, resembling the effect elicited for verbs, though on a smaller scale. So this is not something that we were expecting. For one thing, the referent of the pronoun was there on the screen as participants were describing the event, so the antecedent should not have been ambiguous to the speaker. Furthermore, our pronoun form is integral to its interpretation. It's one of the cues that lets the listener pick out the intended referent. Thus, the stakes for correct pronoun agreement are high, meaning that we wouldn't expect speakers to mix up all that often. And going along with that, we also don't hear people making these errors all the time out in the wild, as opposed to verb attraction errors, which occur rather frequently in both spoken and written language. In addition, it's been proposed that instead of using an inflection process like verb agreement, pronoun agreement is informed directly from the message, which may reduce the opportunity for things to go awry. In fact, particularly in a language like English, the relevant features for determining pronoun form, so number and gender, may even be available from the conceptual representation of the referent, which is presumably accessed during the decision to pronominalize and thus available when you plan pronoun form. Our unexpected finding got us interested in whether this odd effect is reliable, as well as what kinds of processes involved in pronoun planning could lead to these attraction style errors. In this talk, we will show that this pronoun attraction effect persists across a number of settings, suggesting that it is indeed real. The error effect is smaller than that for verbs, but we see indications from the production time course of responses that the underlying processes leading to the errors may actually be happening more often, not just when the errors occur. And we will also talk about the processes that may lead to these errors. We will suggest that the errors are related to the moment-to-moment processes that occur as a speaker manages how to refer to what within the sentence.
To help you understand what our experiments have to contribute, we'll first quickly get you up to speed on the background literature on pronoun production. We are interested in what happens when speakers turn referential intent into a pronoun. There are two important processes involved in pronoun planning: choosing to use a pronoun and choosing its form. We are interested in how these processes overlap as speakers convert a message into a sentence, though the two processes appear to be discussed mostly separately in the literature. On one hand, the literature asking how speakers decide to use a pronoun doesn't mention much about how they decide which form to actually use. There seems to be an assumption that speakers get the relevant features for the pronoun form from accessing the non-linguistic conceptual representation of the referent during the decision to pronominalize. This access might allow a speaker to pick out the relevant features because they are salient in the representation, or because the representation in turn activates the reference lemma, which provides the relevant grammatical features. However, there are several potential issues with this kind of assumption, especially if attraction type errors are possible with pronouns. How could the features be influenced by other items in the discourse if they are activated directly from the referent? Some previous experiments on pronoun form planning have also found attraction style effects for both pronoun number and gender, but these tasks don't let speakers plan the message for themselves. The bulk of the message in these tasks is given in a preamble to be repeated, or the speaker must reference a preamble to figure out what their message should be. For example, here, participants would get this whole part of the sentence in a preamble and only add the tag. These studies also remove an important part of pronoun planning: the decision to use a pronoun. The experiments either explicitly told participants to use a pronoun or to use constructions that require a pronoun. So yes, speakers are saying pronouns, but they are not undergoing the process of turning a message into a sentence. This could potentially lead them to mess up more often, since speakers might not have a clear idea of the message they are conveying or what the referent is. This is where our study comes in. In our experiments, speakers construct their own message to describe a scene where the referent is obvious and visible to the speaker. They don't have any prepackaged linguistic material to interpret or repeat, and there is more of a decision to pronominalize. Although we do guide participants to use a pronoun, we give them a reason to want to use one, other than just to please the experimenter. We're trying to figure out the scope of the extraction style effect we observed to see if or when it goes away, especially as we expand the range of contexts we are looking at, and as we give the speaker more choice of whether to use a pronoun. In doing this, we are starting to engage with both processes involved in pronoun planning and address how they overlap to allow speakers to turn a message into a form. Now on to the experiments.
So in all of our experiments, participants described scenes of aliens performing a made-up action called mimming. So when an alien mims another, the other alien's antenna lights up. In our first experiment, where we originally observed the effect, aliens could also mim themselves, causing their own antenna to light up. Our participants thus made a choice about how to describe the event, and thus whether to produce an object pronoun. We'll focus only on the object pronoun trials here. So for each scene, participants were asked to describe who mimmed whom. But each scene had two groups of aliens. So to specify exactly who performed the action, speakers needed to reference other aliens on the screen. So here, the agent would be the greenie above the pinkies. But then, when describing who is mimmed, the speaker needs to reference the pinkies again, right after just having said the pinkies. So to avoid repeating the noun phrase a second time, participants used the pronoun. This also allowed them to finish talking within the response time window a little more easily because the sentence was shorter. So ultimately, this led them to produce sentences like, the greenie above the pinkies mimmed them. Note that at the point when the speaker plans the pronoun, both the antecedent the pinkies and the lure the greenie are available in the sentence representation, providing this kind of environment where attraction can occur. So we manipulated the number of aliens in the scenes to create different sentence conditions. When looking for attraction, we want to know whether speakers are more likely to make errors when the two nouns in the sentence have different numbers, so these mismatch conditions, than when they have the same number, the match conditions. Note that the subcondition comparisons relevant for our analysis here are a little different from what you usually see in attraction studies, because the pronoun agrees with the second noun in the noun phrase. So we found that errors were significantly more likely in the mismatch conditions. We see this effect in both the subcondition comparisons. So here's where they're supposed to be saying it, and here's where they're supposed to be saying them. Now, some of you may be worrying about this effect and whether it could be explained away by other factors. Rest assured, we've worried about this too. For instance, could it just be a bias to say it that leads to the effect? Well, if that were the case, we shouldn't expect to see elevated errors in this condition, where speakers are supposed to say it, and that wouldn't explain why participants said it more in the mismatch plural condition than the match condition. Another potential concern is that participants are using singular them, but if that were the case, we should also expect to see them used in this condition, when all the nouns in the sentence are singular, and that wouldn't explain the plural contrast when speakers are supposed to say them. We don't think the effect is caused by confusion over the referent, as the referent is visible on screen as the participant utters the sentence. So what we were worried about was that on half the trial, so that is all the reflexive scenes, the first noun in the sentence is the intended antecedent of an anaphor. So perhaps switching between these two sentence types is what caused participants to mess up. So to confirm that our observed attraction effect was not due to the mix of trial types, our second experiment used the same task to elicit only the pronoun trials from experiment 1. This was right when the pandemic hit, so this experiment also tested whether the effect could be elicited online. So we found the same effect again at approximately the same size as before. It thus seems that the error effect, at least in these sentence contexts, is reliable, though again, small. And we even observed it in a different population than the original effect, so an older, more variable MTurk population as opposed to UMD undergraduates.
Even though the first noun in the sentence frame was never the antecedent in any of the trials, it may have had special status as the sentence subject, making it more likely to disrupt pronoun formulation. So we decided to look at sentences in which the pronoun is supposed to refer to the subject to see if we still get interference from non-subject lures. For experiment 3, we changed the scenes so that the participants needed to contrast the object of the miming action instead of the subject. The object contrast is here on the right side, while the group on the left was to make sure the subject was not predictable before the action. This prompted responses like, the greenie mimmed the pinkies below it. This experiment had the same conditions as experiment 1 and 2, though note that now the antecedent is the first noun in the subconditions. We found the attraction effect again, and it was even a bit larger than in the first two experiments. Now we know the effect persists even when the lore is not the subject. However, participants still get the pronoun form right most of the time. So we looked at the production time course of correct sentences to see if there is any interference, even when speakers don't make errors. As we discussed during Thursday's parallel session, for verb attraction, speakers are slower to say correct verbs in the same mismatch environments where errors are more likely. This suggests that the underlying process occurs on more than just the trials where participants made errors. We similarly used a force aligner to look for slowdowns before the pronoun in sentences where participants got the pronoun's features right. We found that participants pause more often in the same conditions where they are more likely to produce errors. This suggests that, like with verbs, pronoun agreement is disrupted in more than the subset of cases where errors occur. However, the effect is small, so we don't know if the process occurs on every trial.
As an aside, we did not find the same effect in our other sentence frame with non-intervening lores. So this could be because the process that leads to attraction from non-intervening lores is less frequent. That would also explain why the error effect was smaller in experiments 1 and 2. And in fact, a similar proposal has been made for non-intervening attractors in verb agreement.
So, to make sure that participants really are making a choice to pronominalize, we are currently running a follow-up study where there is more variety in the scenes participants describe, and whether or not they use a pronoun in the descriptions. On most of the trials, target sentences don't contain pronouns. But on 1/3 of the trials, we create a context where participants can use a pronoun to avoid repeated reference. But we don't show them any examples of this context in the explanation of the task. We are still in the process of collecting and transcribing data, but so far we can tell you that when speakers have the opportunity to use a pronoun, they do, and they are still making pronoun number errors. Crucially, these errors seem to be more common in the mismatch conditions, suggesting we are going to find the attraction style effect again, even with more variability and less training.
So, to sum up so far, we've shown that attraction style number errors for pronouns are reliable across a few different contexts. So we observed this effect in tasks more similar to natural speech than previous pronoun attraction studies, and also when speakers make more of a choice about whether or not to produce a pronoun. Our study further extends previous results by showing an interference effect in production time course, even when no error is made. And so this timing suggests that the process causing the error effect may not be limited to these cases where things go wrong. It's important to highlight, though, that although the attraction style effect for pronouns is real, it is smaller than the attraction effects typically observed for verbs. A smaller effect size could be due to either a uniform antecedent agreement process that's just not as fragile or susceptible to attraction as verb agreement, or because the process doesn't happen as frequently. So we know from our timing analysis that the errors underestimate how often this process occurs, but again, we don't know by how much. Now, in either case, since other items in the sentence appear to influence pronoun planning, our results suggest that pronoun form cannot always be derived directly from the message.
So what sort of representation is used when determining pronoun form? To plan a pronoun, just knowing the message is not enough. Speakers must also know how they've been referring to something in the discourse, particularly for contexts when you use a pronoun within the same sentence as the antecedent, like in our experiments. Knowing the previously used linguistic label is important for determining the pronoun form. For instance, in English, whether you refer to this pictured entity as a pair of scissors or simply scissors influences whether you can use the pronoun it to refer to it later. In languages with grammatical gender, knowing how a referent has been described previously is also important for determining the grammatical gender of the pronoun, as shown here. But just keeping track of the antecedent's label doesn't explain why we see this attraction effect. We propose that speakers in our study reference the sentence representation of the antecedent when planning the pronoun form. When constructing a sentence, speakers already have pressure to keep track of items active in the sentence representation to make sure they comply with formulation constraints, such as anaphor binding and noun phrase repetition. If speakers access the antecedent's representation at this level, where the representation of the lore is also active due to monitoring, this may be what causes them to make attraction style errors. We are currently planning a follow-up study that investigates whether participants still make these errors when pronouns refer to an entity in another sentence. This will let us know whether the circumstances that give rise to the effect are exclusive to intrasentential pronominalization.
So more specifically, what kind of process may lead to the observed attraction style effect? So although we can't conclusively say what's going on, we do have a proposal for you. So thinking back to these two processes we introduced at the beginning, so deciding to use a pronoun and determining its form, we propose that there's an overlap between the properties that make a referent a good candidate for a pronoun and those that make a representation likely to cause interference. We adopt the theory of pronoun selection in which an in-focus status of the non-linguistic mental representation of the referent cues the speaker to produce a pronoun instead of a full noun phrase. We suggest that when a speaker is going to refer again to an entity in a sentence, they note the in-focus status of the referent, which prompts them to pronominalize. The speaker then uses a retrieval process to look for the corresponding linguistic representation to get its features to determine pronoun form. It's in this step that we think that the error occurs. So when a conceptual referent is in focus in the discourse, its relevant linguistic representation may similarly have prominent mental status, for instance, a high activation in working memory. In normal circumstances, this prominence may help the retrieval process to pick out the right representation by making it easier to retrieve. You can then use the representation's number feature to plan the pronoun. However, in our sentence frames, there may be more than one item in focus at the point when speakers plan the pronoun. So in experiments 1 and 2, the subject may be in focus because it was recently activated for verb agreement, or simply because it's the subject. In experiment 3, the lore noun individuated by the modifier containing the pronoun may be in focus due to recency or due to the fact that it's being individuated. If we think that there's a link between the reference focus and the prominence of its sentence representation, this means that the lore should also be prominent in working memory and thus ready to compete when the speaker plans the pronoun. These lores may be particularly prominent in our sentences if speakers are keeping track of items in the sentence to abide by formulation constraints. So the presence of these two prominent items in working memory that match similar retrieval cues may accidentally lead the process to pick out the number feature of the lore instead of the intended noun phrase, thus leading to an error. Note that this proposal predicts fewer errors when the other entities under discussion are not as in focus during pronoun planning.
This is one potential explanation for what is causing the attraction effect, but we are still learning more about the full scope of the effect and the boundaries of where it occurs. Our study suggests that when speakers decide to use a pronoun, they might not be doing something as simple as getting the form from the conceptual representation. There may be reasons why speakers do something more complicated when managing reference within a sentence, but this process may still happen only in a subset of cases, and referential processes may proceed differently in different contexts. There could also be some properties of our task that make speakers more vulnerable to errors, such as novel words, repeating sentence frames, and not having reference continuity across trials. That being said, we do feel confident that this attraction effect is real. The fact that the effect is small may explain why we don't notice this kind of error all that often in the wild. The underlying agreement process could still be occurring under the surface, but we may need more precise conditions to make attraction possible, and overt errors may be rare even when these conditions are met. But just because errors are rare doesn't mean they aren't important. For a process like pronoun reference that speakers almost always get right, the cases when they do mess up provide an important window into how the process works. Thanks for listening, and thanks to everyone that helped with the project and the presentation, as well as to our funding sources.
And we're excited to hear your questions.
All right, thank you very much for that great talk. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and you can just type your questions in Q&A. All right, we already have some questions here. So Jennifer Arnold, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. And so actually, I've been kind of piling up the questions, and so I had two that I posted, but which are about the theoretical interpretation and whether you think a similar thing could happen with gender, because similarly, very rarely I observe gender errors. And I mean like he, she errors, not, I mean, you know, there's the newer case of non-binary pronouns and those confuse people, but you know, even with very well practiced he, she, you get very rare errors, and maybe it'd be a similar process. Although I think you could possibly get that from accessing the conceptual representation, it wouldn't necessarily take the linguistic one. So those are kind of 2 points that you might respond to. And then the third one is that potentially this sort of interference could also affect the choice of whether to use a pronoun. There's a whole literature on gender ambiguity and whether that and how that affects whether you use a pronoun. And so Cuny Fukumura and colleagues in particular have done a lot of work on this, and they argue that it has to do with representation as opposed to ambiguity avoidance.
Yeah, so we are definitely interested in what would happen with gender. Specifically, we're thinking of some potential follow-up studies that look at linguistic gender, though, as we know, there's also the kind of gender that you might get from the conceptual referent. And so if we're going with properties of linguistic gender, our proposal that we've laid out for you with this sort of retrieval process that goes awry should predict that you should still see the same kind of error with grammatical gender, because you're picking out, again, the wrong referent and should get the gender of that other referent.
I mean, with conceptual gender too, right? It wouldn't have to be linguistic gender.
Right. Well, and as we said, that the process could occur differently in different contexts. So specifically in all of our studies is looking at this intrasentential pronominalization, but especially if you are maybe starting a sentence de novo or just deciding how to refer to something, you can get it from the conceptual representation and it wouldn't be available in the sentence representation. Like if you think of a discourse like, oh, look at that person, she's wearing a hat. You can't get the she from the person necessarily. So then it would have to come from the conceptual representation. Maybe. Yeah. Does that address your points?
Sure, thanks. We could talk more later. There's a lot of things to talk about there. Yeah.
I need to unmute myself. Okay, thank you. So there's another question here from Shannon McKnight, and I will read this question. So do you think that there is an interference threshold that is perhaps A, individually variable, and or B, could be experimentally manipulated in some way? Could you introduce more errors by reducing this threshold, like in a speeded response task?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And often in attraction studies, we do see individual differences in how often people make errors. I don't think we can tell from this data whether or not that's due to an interference threshold, but there are a couple of interesting studies that do manipulate things like the presence of distractors or the need to inhibit things as you're producing sentences with a verb agreement. And so I could imagine some sort of manipulation where here similarly we look at differences in cognitive control capacities and then introduce some sort of task like Zari Nomaki had a study, I think that was 2018, I don't remember the exact year, but a manipulation like theirs in which you have things that you need to ignore and see how well people ignore those, the extent to which that affects errors, and how well that correlates with their individual cognitive control ability scores on a different task, like a flanker task or something like that.
Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes. If there are other questions, you can type them in. Okay, looks like we have answered all the questions from the audience. All right, thank you both very much. So I'm going to move on to the next presentation. So our next talk comes from Julian Jara Ettinger and Paula Rubio Fernandez. So Paula will be presenting, and the title of the talk is A Computational Model of Reference Production Based on Listener Visual Search Costs. Go ahead, Paula.
Thank you, Ming. Okay, so Xin, thank you very much for staying to our talk. Since this is the last talk of the conference, we thought we could perhaps start dreaming of Cuny 2022, when we'll hopefully be able to get together again. And I think I should also update to our new fancy name. And let's imagine that we are at the conference dinner and you're talking to John Truswell and Anna Papafragu, and John offers you guys a drink. You look around and you think, I would love one of those red cocktails. So later in the evening, you come back to your table and you ask a colleague to please pass you the red cocktail. Now, here is less clear as why you would ask about the red cocktail, since there are obviously no other cocktails on your table. But we know from the experimental record that people tend to use modification redundantly, especially color adjectives. And Julian and I have been working in this area for a number of years, arguing that in physically grounded reference, modification is often used descriptively rather than contrastively in order to facilitate the listener's visual search for the referent. Now, in this view, the adjective red may be strictly speaking redundant or unnecessary, but it did not violate the Grecian maxim of quantity. After all, if you remember, Grice specified that one should be as informative as is required for the purpose of the exchange. So if your purpose is to make sure your colleague finds your cocktail, you may mention its color. Now, so far our results have supported our account of overspecification, but we wanted to test it further. We wanted to test it computationally, and that's why we built the Incremental Collaborative Efficiency Model, or ICE for short. Now, this is obviously not the only model of reference production in the market. In fact, in 2019, yes, Van Gompel and colleagues, they published a PRO model, a probabilistic referential overspecification model within the natural language generation framework. And according to this model, speakers first choose a property that rules out all distractors. And in case there's more than one such property, then they probabilistically choose one based on preference. And there's a third step where the speaker may add an extra property depending on how eager they are to overspecify. Now, even more recently, Deegan and colleagues have also published an RSA model with Noisy Semantics. That's a model of reference production within the Rational Speech Act framework, which, as you know, treats speakers as rational agents that trade off utterance cost and informativity. More specifically, this model varies speaker production costs, which we'll later refer to as egocentric costs. And they use probabilistic meanings. And here, let me give you a completely made-up example from our Cuny party. Imagine that in that context, there was a 5% chance that red didn't mean red, another 5% chance that cocktail perhaps didn't mean cocktail, and the speaker may then decide to refer to the red cocktail instead of just the cocktail to secure successful reference. So this is their account of overspecification. And as one would expect, the ICE model is similar and different to these other models in different respects. But the main contribution, I think, of the model is already highlighted in the title. It calculates efficiency incrementally, but also collaboratively. And that's how we're going to start the talk. We'll first explain what we mean by incremental and collaborative efficiency. Then I'll give you a high-level description of the ICE model using color versus material properties as a test case. And then I'll give us a very slightly more technical description of the model and 3 tests. The first test is based on simulation of attested patterns of reference production. The second is based on real data from published studies. And the third one is based on description ratings, which we collected specifically to test the model more accurately. So starting with incremental efficiency, what do we mean with that? Well, for the last few years, we've also been doing some cross-linguistic work, comparing languages with different adjective position. In English, the blue triangle; in Spanish, el triángulo azul. And what this eye tracking study showed is that English speakers establish color contrast across the entire display. They first narrow down their search to the 2 blue shapes, and then, among those, select the triangle. The reverse is obviously true of Spanish. We establish contrast within, color contrast within the triangles, selecting the blue one as we hear the adjective. Now, these results show what we already knew, if you like, that language is processed incrementally and efficiency. Look here, there's no interference. As soon as you have enough information, you can identify a referent. What was interesting for us is that these differences in how speakers of English and Spanish establish color contrast affect the way that they use color adjectives in production. And this is a difference that has been observed in several studies now. English speakers would refer to the blue triangle more often than Spanish speakers would refer to el triángulo azul. And interestingly as well, this difference is modulated by the density of the display. So when these speakers had to request the shape in a denser display, both groups produce significantly more redundant modification, and the difference between the two language groups disappeared. So this is why we argue that the efficiency of a referential expression needs to be calculated incrementally as language is processed and in relation to the entire visual display, and not only in relation to the competitors or the number of triangles. What about collaborative efficiency? Well, here our work is very much inspired by Herb Clark's. We also see reference as a collaborative process whereby speaker and listener try to minimize their joint effort. And a metric of collaborative efficiency, we think, needs to take into account the relative difficulty of the listener's visual search for the referent. This is what we've tried to do in the ICE model. Now, at high level of description, this is a model of reference production that simulates how a listener would search for an object in real time as they process words incrementally. And we use the greater discriminability of color versus material as a test case. So the model operationalizes this difference by assuming that the listener can detect color from the visual periphery, but they need to fixate on an object to detect their material or its kind. This means that in hearing green, you may be able to detect a green object from your periphery, but in order to find something plastic or a chair, you would have to actually fixate on the object. And the results of an eye tracking study that we conducted as part of the study confirmed this starting assumption. These are the eye movements of participants who process the metal chair, a metal description. As you can see, they effectively compare the two chairs before clicking on the target. Whereas in hearing the green chair, they were able to identify the target without comparison. And talking of comparison, it's important to remember that both color and material are absolute properties. They are not relative. The difference is just that color is more visually salient or more discriminable. And as part of the same study, we collected not only eye movements and response times, but also average ratings for the two types of descriptions. And as we expected, color participants reported that they would be more ready to use color than material, in fact, almost twice as often. But for us, the more interesting pattern of results is that these two measures were strongly correlated. Participants gave higher ratings to those descriptions that resulted in faster response times. And this strong correlation was kept when we analyzed color and material adjectives separately. So it's not just an effect driven by color. It's also important to bear in mind that participants weren't told anything about visual search or visual salience. They were just asked how often would you, or how likely you are to use either of these two descriptions. And so color is more discriminable than material. I think these results show that, and probably it was everybody's intuition. But most importantly, these results show that speakers are sensitive to this difference, which is very much at the heart of our account of overspecification and of the ICE model. Now, what we also do in the paper is to compare the ICE model to a brevity model. This brevity model is inspired in a literal interpretation of Grice, say as much as necessary, but no more. Whereas, as I already suggested, the ICE model is based on the idea that speakers aim to minimize the listener's search time. Both models are comparable in that they reward successful communication, but the brevity model incurs a cost for each word the speaker uses, whereas words are free in our model, but there's a cost over listener search time. So this is the basic structure. Now, let's quickly go over the model equation. So on the left is the utility of an utterance U to convey message M, which is the same as a measure of communicative success, which is a function of the probability that the listener recovers message M upon hearing utterance U minus utterance costs. Perhaps a more intuitive way to read this equation is that the utility of an utterance is a balance between two well-known forces, the informativity or expressivity of the utterance and production costs, or in Grice's words, say enough, but not too much. Now, Julian and I are particularly interested in theory of mind and this term, because it can be understood as a theory of mind component, perhaps in more linguistic friendly terms, audience design or perspective taking. And how is that? Well, here the speaker is supposed to be estimating the likelihood that the listener will understand what they mean from what they said. And this can be understood as a form of mind reading. Not everybody would agree, but it can be seen that way. And the most interesting part, we think, of the Asl model is that the cost function is also a theory of mind component. How is that? Well, because if you remember, in the brevity model, standard way, the production costs are calculated egocentrically for the speaker. Whereas in the Asl model, the costs are alter-centric. The speaker is evaluating the difficulty of the listener's visual search, and that again can be seen as a form of mind reading. Now, I'm happy to say that we are, working on the Asl model with the idea of exploring the relationship between language and theory of mind, which I think is a fundamental and a very exciting question. And let's now get to another question, not sidetracked. Can the Asl model explain color over specification? And if you remember, the first test was based on simulations. We wanted to see if the model would simulate 3 patterns of reference production. The first one is speaker's tendency to produce more redundant color adjectives the denser the display is with objects. And that's indeed what the model simulations show. The second pattern is speaker's tendency to produce less redundant color adjectives the less discriminable the color of the target is in the display, or to put it differently, the more monochrome the display is. And that's indeed what we observe here. And the third pattern is, again, speaker's tendency to produce more redundant modification the denser the display, but modulated by adjective position. And as we would have predicted, there were more redundant pre-nominal adjectives than post-nominal adjectives. So the model passes the first test. But we also wanted to test it on real data, and we selected 4 data sets from past papers, which were collected. These are referential communication studies conducted in the lab, is naturalistic real-time data, using different types of displays, I should explain. And here you can see the model predictions against the proportion of over-specification, and there's a strong correlation at 0.89. Here, we should also highlight perhaps that this is the same model predicting these 4 data sets. We didn't have to add any extra components or parameters or even fit the parameters to data. So I think this speaks clearly about the strength of the model. And the last test is based on description ratings. You may wonder, why do you want to collect description ratings when you already have production data? This is a model of language reference production. Well, because in order to test the model more accurately, we are not only interested in what speakers would say, but in what they feel or how they evaluate the referential choices they didn't make. So here you may refer to this basket as the basket, but also the purple basket, the woolen basket, or the purple woolen basket. And according to the brevity model, the basket, the shorter description, is best, followed by the 2 descriptions with 1 modifier, and last is the purple woolen basket. The Asl model, on the other hand, has a preference for the purple basket, followed by the purple woolen basket, which is indeed what we observe in participant judgments. Here we have another trial with 2 blue chairs, 1 metal, 1 plastic. And the brevity model prefers the metal chair over the blue metal chair, again, because it's shorter, and has a strong dispreference for the chair and the blue chair, because those are underinformative. They are ambiguous referential expressions. The same dispreference in the Asl model, but there's a stronger preference for the blue metal chair, which is also what the participant judgments showed. And just another quick example, so you can see how participant judgments are more in line with the Asl model than with the brevity model. And all in all, this is indeed what we observe. The model predictions for the Asl model are closer to participant judgments, with a strong correlation at 0.93, which is significantly higher than what we observe for the brevity model at 0.7, which is significantly weaker. And the conclusions are clear, I think. The Asl model outperforms a brevity model based on word penalty. Our model can explain different patterns of adjective use on the collaborative assumption that speakers are motivated to help their listener identify the referent. And last but not least, the ICE model offers a way to explore the relationship between language and theory of mind, which I'm happy to report we are already investigated by developing the model. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Paula, for that great talk. So we have time for questions. Okay, so our first question comes from Mary Ellen McDonald.
Shall I stop sharing or just leave it there?
I think you can leave it there.
Okay.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I'm wondering about the claim that what the speakers are doing is aiming to help the listener's visual search. I see that using redundant color certainly does help the listener's visual search, and we certainly know that sometimes speakers do try to help listeners, but there's also a tradition in literature about how speakers don't always have the capacity to be so helpful. And I'm thinking about Boaz Kezar and colleagues' work suggesting that it's actually quite computationally expensive under some circumstances to calculate the needs of the listener. And instead, the shortcut is to calculate it off of one's own state, the speaker's own state. And in your case, if I understand it, the times when the color mention is going to be useful for the listener is exactly the same situation in which the color is salient in the display for the speaker. So when it's prominent and salient, it gets mentioned. And so therefore, I'm wondering how much component of the aiming to help the listener is needed here. Thanks.
Okay, I really have to thank you, Mary-Ellen, for this question because I was hoping it would come up. We've been thinking about this a long time because if you're interested in theory of mind and audience design, this is the kind of angle that you take. And first of all, I gave a shorter talk today talking about how this type of view is compatible with speaker efficient, both listener and speaker efficient count, right? So the speaker may be relying on visual heuristics, as we call them, for example, the greater salience or discriminability of color, or the presence of color contrastive properties like things varying in color or varying in size. Those type of prompts can be used as heuristics that facilitate audience design in a not so costly manner. I'm not going to say automatic, but let's say pragmatically cheap. And in general, I don't think that we need to see audience design as something that is computationally expensive. Vic Ferreira has a model which we've used in the short talk I presented earlier, where he distinguishes process of audience design that are indeed more costly, that require more meta judgments perhaps, versus strategies that we might learn through experience, like the greater salience of color. And in cases of co-presence, right, you're talking about situations of co-presence where something may be salient for me, also salient for you, where there all I need to appreciate is that we are co-present, right? So we shouldn't mix their egocentric or not audience design with efficiency, right? So if I know that something is salient for me and I can trust that your perceptual mechanisms are comparable to mine, why not refer to a salient property, right? If I do the same on the phone and I tell you, oh, look at this, but then isn't it great? You tell me, what are you talking about? That would be a failure to take your perspective. But in situations of co-presence, like where we collect data, sure, you can trust your own, but if you're sensitive to it being co-present, I think is audience design. And I should stop there. Julian, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I could keep going.
Okay, thank you. Is there any follow-up from Mary-Ellen on that? Okay. All right, so while we're waiting for more questions coming in, I actually want to follow up on that first question. So if I remember correctly, there are more modifiers produced when it's in a pre-nominal than a post-nominal position. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what we observed.
Is that not expected if the speaker is purely thinking about the listener's search time? Because it seems like in both situations, the listener would have a roughly equal amount of difficulty in finding the right target.
Yes, but if identifying a blue thing is faster than identifying a triangle, using a pre-nominal color adjective may be helpful. And we have eye tracking data showing that you are faster to find the blue star than the star. Whereas in a four-shape display, when you hear la estrella in Spanish, you're probably already there. It's a pretty long word. So adding an extra adjective afterwards would really feel redundant. And in fact, we started working on this with that intuition that in Spanish, it felt weirder than in English to say the blue star when there's only one star.
You mean the production time on the noun itself gives listener enough time to make the search happen? That's why the post-nominal modifier is not.
Because in processing the star, and if the display is sparse, you would have already, you have enough time to find the target, yes. So by the time you produce the adjective, the participant may already be clicking.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions?
There's something here, that is a chat.
All right, looks like we have answered all the questions from the audience. Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, actually, we have a new question coming in just now. Okay, so this is from Roger Levy.
Okay.
Oh, okay, so I can read the question. Are there other types of adjectives other than color or material that you think you could extend your model to test?
I think they would have to be absolute for fair comparison. Can you think of any, Julian?
Well, yeah, I mean, like in particular, like Paula and I have talked about, I think scalar adjectives are really interesting. Those actually, they also involve like an interesting model development that we need to add, which is in eye tracking data, when you have a scalar adjective, people don't just look for the object, they try to find like, what are you contrasting it with? So that's an even richer model of visual search that we don't have yet. But that's something that I'm pretty excited about. The idea like, yeah, if you hear the big cup, that you're not just gonna search until you find something that you consider big relative to like some abstract baseline, but you're trying to figure out what is it getting contrasted with.
Yeah. And there to follow up is also interesting the different adjective position, because in Spanish, for example, you will get the noun modify by big. So it would be, again, the reverse visual search. So having an incremental model there is also very, very important if the property is relative or scalar.
All right. Okay, so Roger typed another comment I will read out. Yes, that seems like a great place to take the model, especially because the comparison class may need to be resolved. Yeah, that's what you are suggesting.
Thank you, Roger.
All right, thank you very much. So that concludes our last session. I think John is here to make some remarks.
Yes, hold on for just a second. Okay. Okay, one more thing here. Okay, yes, this is the end of the conference, and before finishing, I just want to make sure that I provide a special thanks to everyone involved. I thank these people at the beginning of the conference, and I want to thank them again because they've done so much work throughout it. In particular, let me first start actually with thanking the Asl Interpreters. They've been a terrific help and very flexible with us and helping us out throughout the whole conference. And then, of course, the organizing committee, they did a great deal in helping select this program. It was a lot of work to go through all these excellent abstracts, or many of them to choose from. And it really was a joint effort to try to identify the ones that would make an interesting program. And of course, thank everybody involved in who gave these presentations. They were really interesting, terrific work. And want to thank Jessica Marcus again for all of the help that she's provided, and Victor Gomez for helping out with the website. And of course, all of the graduate students and postdocs and former postdocs that helped out. There were a number of them: Caroline Beach, Andrea Beltrama, Abby Clements, Monica Doe, Martin Ip, Sandy LaTourette, Daojin Lee, Christine So, Erjan Vujan, Yosian White. Just thanks to everybody. They were great help, particularly with the parallel sessions and doing the Zoom sessions for them. Now, I have to point out something that it's really, I think, quite important to point out here, is that this actually officially is the final Cuny conference because we are changing our name. And I don't think that any of us thought that this would be how the final Cuny conference would end, on the internet, done virtually. But I think that at least we can try to think back a little bit to where the conference began in New York, and take advantage of visiting it virtually. That one of the greatest cities in the world, New York City, where Cuny originated, the conference originated. I remember going there many years ago for the first time. I think it was actually the first time I ever visited New York City as well. And it was just an amazing experience intellectually. I mean, Janet Fodor set up a terrific conference from the very beginning. And so I think that it would be fitting to actually end virtually at the Graduate Center in Cuny, and just remind everybody that this has been an amazing conference over the years, but it hasn't ended. Maybe someday we'll go back to New York for a conference. I sure hope so. And we'll be doing the conference again. I'm sure that we'll have next year. We'll have a terrific conference. We don't know where it is yet. We don't know where it's going to be yet. But that's something that the society is trying to decide. So I'm going to leave you with New York, and just thank everybody again for such a terrific experience, and thank all the speakers. It was a great conference, really interesting. So with that, if I can sign off here, I think actually that to do this, I actually have to stop my share screen, unfortunately, and say goodbye this way. So see you later, everybody.
Thank you, John.